This is Audible.
Sounds True presents The Inner Technology of Prayer, tuning oneself to the creative forces of the universe, with scientist, spiritual teacher, and the author of The Isaiah Effect and the God Code, Gregg Braden.
Almost universally, ancient texts, prophecies, in these traditions, there is a reference to a mode of prayer. And again, this mode of prayer transcends science, religion, and mysticism as we know it today. We're reminded that it's a highly sophisticated technology that we embody as an awareness, as a consciousness. It's less about an outward expression and more about something we become. We're reminded that we have today and have always had direct access to the creative forces of our world through this inner technology that we call prayer. The ancient Essenes, in texts now that have been translated directly from the Dead Sea Scrolls, begin to describe this technology to us in the only words that they had, the only words of their time. They begin by reminding us that we live in three places. We experience this world through three modes of experience. They say three are the dwellings of the sons and daughters of man. No one may come before the face of the Creator or the God who knows not peace in each of these three: body, thought, and feeling. And they go on to describe body essentially as what they equate with emotion. They viewed emotion as being experienced in our bodies. So this is the beginning of a technology, and this is the first time in any of the ancient traditions I've seen this so concise, so clearly broken out and referenced in such a way that it allows us to go in and actually address them individually and merge them into a common technology. So we live in body, thought, and feelings. Now they go on to say that when these three become as one, when we find a way in our lives to reconcile our feeling world, our emotional world, and our thinking world into a single directive force in our world, that's when you say to the mountain, "Mountain, move away," and the mountain will move away. It has to move away. And this is the beginning of the Essene technology, where they're sharing with us prayer. From their perspective, the ancient Essenes had a wonderful world view and life view, very simple, very eloquent. They essentially view our bodies, the human form, as a mirror of parameters that we live in our lives. They defined 6 parameters. They said that our body simply is a resonator. It's a mirror of these parameters. When something occurs in our bodies that we choose to change, we simply look to one or some combination of these 6 parameters to change. The parameters are thought, feeling, and emotion, breath, nutrient, and movement. Well, through the ancient technology of prayer, we've addressed 3 of those parameters, because prayer, of the many ways it may be defined, is the combination of a particular quality of thought, feeling, and emotion. So prayer may be defined as just that. It's a quality of thought, feeling, and emotion that allows us to tune our biological circuitry. Western researchers now view every cell in our body as a minute electrical circuit that transmits, receives, it stores, it has capacitance, its resistance, vector energy, scalar energy. These tiny circuits. Prayer allows us to tune our biological circuitry to creation. It's how we find ourselves either in tune or out of tune with the nature and the world that surrounds us. So from this perspective now, we're invited to allow for the possibility that prayer transcends religion. And I'm just amazed as I travel to cities throughout the West, how deeply ingrained within individuals and families and groups, the concept remains that prayer somehow is religious in nature. And I'll invite you, if you haven't done so already, to find your own journey and explore through these ancient traditions and these texts, now as the translations become available, and demonstrate this for yourself, that prayer is a communion between humans and the forces of this world. It transcends religion, and you begin to see where religions and religious dogma and the rules and the regulations were built around this technology. So prayer transcends science in the true sense of the Western world of science today, because prayer allows for possibilities that science cannot explain through the rigid dogma of the science that we see today, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's that rigid dogma applied in its completeness, in its entirety, that I believe will lead the Western world into the place where, once again, we're not discovering anything. We're simply redefining it in a language we're comfortable with. So it is that rigidity, that dogma, that will lead science into the place where they witness today phenomena they cannot account for. Their understanding of prayer, I believe, then will flesh out our understandings of our world and allow us to embrace an even greater worldview. Prayer transcends the mystical traditions as well. It's more than simply mysticism. It's all of these perhaps combined and bring us to a point where we may launch forward into a new wisdom that has no name as yet. What we can say is that prayer is an ancient and highly sophisticated vibratory technology. When I say that prayer transcends science, I'm often asked precisely what I mean by that. Perhaps some of the best examples come from the world of physics. And as I've studied some of the works of the great physicists, Max Planck, for example, what a brilliant man, a very brave man. When he accepted his Nobel Prize in physics, he made a statement during his acceptance speech that shocked the scientific community. And it was a tremendous insight into the place where physics had led him in his life. Essentially what he said was that as a man who has spent his entire life studying matter, I can tell you this much. Max Planck said there is no matter as such. Our entire world is made of succeedingly smaller patterns of vibratory fields, nested one within another within another. And beneath these fields, we must assume that there is an intelligence or a mind, and we call that creative force God. And one of the reasons he and other physicists have found these dilemmas in physics, especially in the quantum world, is because they reach a point in the subatomic world where the laws of physics appear to break down and something else begins to happen. The random principles, the way that forces interact with one another, there's something happening there. There's an element that's missing. Einstein knew this, and he referenced it many times as well. Perhaps as another example, let me just give you one more brief example. We'll come back and explore this in more detail. It wasn't that long ago, there was a lot of discussion about a new form of energy that we called cold fusion. Cold fusion was in all the science magazines, the tech journals. And all of a sudden, we stopped hearing quite as much about it. You'll still see articles every once in a while, and not as much. One of the problems with cold fusion is that the experiments did not work predictably every time they were carried out. Sometimes the cold fusion would occur, sometimes it wouldn't. And it took a group of very insightful researchers to actually go forward with a scientific method of control samples and experimental samples. And what they discovered was a surprise to them as well as the other researchers who were working. They discovered that when a team of researchers is in the room with a cold fusion experiment and that team expects the cold fusion to be successful, more often than not, it is. And when a team of skeptical researchers were in the room and they doubted that the cold fusion would work, more often than not, it did not. And the statistics were so high, they said there's something is happening here. And what it led them to understand was that their expectation of success or failure, their thought, feeling, and emotion was playing a role in the outcome of the experiments. And now we know that thought, feeling, and emotion are digitally measurable vibratory templates They're a thing. They interact with our world. Prayer is the union of thought, feeling, and emotion. Prayer is a specific quality, a parameter of these thought, feelings, and emotions, allowing us to interact with the forces inside of our body as well as those beyond our body. So once again, prayer becomes considered as a very sophisticated technology. A few months ago, I was doing a program, and a woman in the audience asked me a question. She said, okay, I understand what you're saying. Why prayer? Why would we ever choose prayer? What good is prayer really in our world? What if we don't have prayer in our world? I'd never been asked that question before, and I thought about it for a moment. And this, again, was one of those times when I really had no idea of what was about to come out of my mouth, and I opened my mouth to speak, and these words tumbled out. And what the words said was that prayer is to our quality of life as water is to the seed of a plant. And after I'd said that, I stepped back and I thought about what I just said. And I said, wow, I like that. Now, what does it mean? Prayer is to our quality of life as water is to the seed of a plant. The seed of a plant is whole and complete unto itself. And it may exist in that form as a seed unchanged for thousands of years. We're now recovering seeds in earthen vessels from Egypt and the high Andes in Peru, and those seeds are still intact. Some of them will still germinate, and they're still a seed. In the presence of water, however, the seed is allowed to blossom to its greatest expression, the greatest potential of its life. And I believe that is true of prayer to us. We may exist, and we may walk through this waking dream that we call life in the presence of one another, day in and day out for 1,000 generations. And we are whole and complete and intact and enabled unto ourselves. And in the presence of prayer, the communion between us and the creative forces of our world, our bodies and one another, we then have the opportunity to blossom to our fullest expression, the greatest potential of what it means to be human. And that was the answer to her question. This is the value of prayer in general, specifically at this time in human and earth history, as we are on the threshold of this great change that is referenced by so many and also the subject of a lot of controversy by so many. Whatever it is that we're about to experience, whatever it is that's about to happen in our world, we are better suited to address the great challenges of our world as our most realized possibility. And I believe that's what prayer offers for us. Well, in our world today, our Western world, we have been conditioned in the last 1,700 years to see ourselves as separate from the circuitry, if you will. If you view our world as an electrical circuit of living components that all work with one another to create the reality that we know, we've been conditioned to believe that we are separate from that, to view ourselves as separate and distinct from this circuit. What prayer allows us to do, it invites us to view ourselves, rather than being separate, as a component. We are part of our world. And this is so powerfully important, and the Essenes were masters at conveying this understanding. We watch the Nature Channel sometimes, or Discovery on television, and we'll see documentaries of researchers that go in to observe portions of the earth, or to witness populations of animals. And that's our thinking, that we're observing and we're witnessing. The reality is that we are participating in. We are Earth. We're not just part of the Earth. We are Earth. Our bodies are Earth. The minerals, the water, the light, the air of this world is what our bodies are made out of. And we are a part of all that we see. Every choice that we make in every moment of life has some influence on the world around us, sometimes to a greater extent, sometimes to a lesser extent. And that's the value of the holographic model. In 1947, there was a brilliant researcher, actually a Renaissance man. He was a musician, a painter, a philosopher, an author, an artist, and a scientist. His name was Dr. Hans Jenny, Jenny. In 1947, Dr. Hans Jenny developed the apparatus that allowed us for the first time to witness the relationship between vibration and form. In his laboratory, in the laboratory conditions, Dr. Jenny would take different materials. Sometimes they were liquid, sometimes they were powders. He'd project vibration into them. He would create vibratory sequences, and as he projected them into his equipment, he could actually see the pattern, see the geometry from the vibration. Sometimes they were audible, sometimes they weren't, and they were all vibrations. And what he found was essentially this, that at lower frequencies, the patterns are very simple. And as the frequencies increased, the patterns became more complex. And that was the essence of what came from those studies, the many things he determined. The lower the vibration, the lower the frequency, the simpler the patterns, the higher the frequency, the more complex. Well, now what we know is that thought, feeling, and emotion are vibration. And as we have lower frequencies of thought, feeling, and emotion, our patterns are simple. As we have higher frequencies of thought, feeling, and emotion, our patterns are more complex. The more complex they are, the more opportunities those vibratory patterns have to influence the world within us and the world around us. Well, high frequency patterns from thought, feeling, and emotion are what we consider through the words love, compassion, peace, forgiveness. Those are considered higher vibratory patterns. Lower vibratory patterns, anger, rage, hate, jealousy, fear, all aspects of fear. So as we wander through the ancient traditions, we're invited to embrace these higher vibratory qualities in our lives. Now, they didn't have the words to describe. They didn't know about Dr. Hans Jenny's vibratory apparatus and the science known as Cymatics. They didn't know about maybe frequencies and waveforms. They shared with us in the only words of their time that our greatest attributes are drawn from deep within us through our expressions, compassion, love, peace, forgiveness, and now we've simply rediscovered that, redefined it through our own science in a language that we're comfortable with. What researchers now understand is that emotion actually provides the template for active DNA in our bodies, directly affecting our immune systems and our ability to reproduce cells. Okay, that's happening inside of our bodies. Researchers have also discovered now that emotion, vibratory template, has a direct linear effect on material outside of our bodies, on the world around us. Think about what that means. Is it possible the way you feel about your world or about something that's happened in your world, could it possibly have any effect outside of your body on the world around you? And the answer now is yes. In 1995, studies were conducted by the HeartMath Institute in Boulder Creek, California. It's very interesting the way they chose to perform these studies. They took participants out into nature, and they seated them in nature, and they placed probes at specific strategic locations on the participant and in nature. They had probes in the ground for 2 feet, 3 feet, 5 feet, 50 feet away from the person. They had digital measuring equipment where they could measure the effects on leaves of trees and on the bark and on the rocks surrounding this participant. And they would ask the participant to become angry. And in the anger, what they found was that the earth around the participant responded in one way, and in joy and compassion that the earth responded in another way. They actually measured digitally the frequency response of rocks, trees, and leaves in the moment of what's called coherent emotion. In the moment where we align thought, feeling, and emotion into joy or into compassion, and the leaves and the trees and the earth responded, those frequencies were picked up by the probes within a 50-foot radius of the individual who is being tested. So if one individual, at least in that instance, under those conditions, what was happening within that individual was being picked up and influencing living and non-living forms of matter within 50 feet. Well, this is really interesting, and it led to another series of experiments that asked something even greater. that was hosted by the HeartMath Institute. They invited a Russian Nobel Prize winning physicist to the United States. His name was Vladimir Poponan. Why would they invite a light scientist to study the patterns and the effects of emotion in our world? From the world of quantum physics, our world is made of light. It's made of quanta. It's made of photons, little particles of light sometimes. Sometimes they act as waves. And our world may be thought of as being composed of these minute packets of energy that we call quanta. There are sometimes particles or waves. The question was, does our emotion have any effect on light, on the quantum world around us? So they devised some very ingenious experiments, and these were under laboratory conditions. The first experiment was to create a vacuum inside of a glass vessel, and they measured what was left in terms of light inside this vessel, and what they found was that the photons were scattered randomly throughout the vessel. That's exactly what they expected to see. The next thing they did was they took the same vessel now, and they introduced a tissue sample containing human DNA. And to their amazement, what they discovered was that the photons actually aligned themselves to the patterns of DNA. Then they took it one step further. They removed the DNA. The net effect was, when they went back in, even though the DNA was gone, the photons were still aligned to what had been there in the past. The effect now is known as the phantom DNA effect. Now think about what this means. At least in these conditions, in the laboratory condition, for the first time, there was a phenomenon that was demonstrated that's been referenced through ancient texts, ancient traditions for thousands of years. And now we come full circle with this technology. If human thought, feeling, and emotion dictate the arrangement of the DNA in our bodies, and the DNA in our bodies is now affecting the arrangement of matter outside of our bodies, then as we change our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, we change our DNA, and our DNA changes the patterns outside of our bodies. And we come full circle. Now we have the essence and the mechanism for a technology. Here we are moving through our world, perceiving through thought, emotion. We combine the two together and we have our world of feeling. Okay, our world of feeling, those are our beliefs, our perceptions. They create a measurable vibration that now is documented as ordering sequences of DNA inside of our bodies. And now, through the phantom DNA effect, at least under these conditions, that DNA inside of the tissue is ordering, it's coding matter outside of our bodies. And that matter is what we have our feelings about. And our feelings are what create the vibration for the ordering. Once again, we come full circle. This is the beginning of a technology that up until very, very recently our science has not allowed for. And this opens up the door to vast, new, exciting possibilities, maybe a little frightening for some people, and very empowering for others. In 1997, I was fortunate enough, my wife Melissa and I, to lead a group of about 40 participants into Egypt. Well, something very unexpected happened. Somehow President Mubarak, President of Egypt, Mubarak, granted us access into temple sites and tombs and locations, many of which I have never been. In my 12 years of going to Egypt, some hadn't been open to the West for over 60 years, we were told. One of those sites was on the west bank of the Nile. It is an underground tomb that has a domed ceiling and is about 30 feet long by about 15 feet wide. And as we descended into the 200 stone stairs to get into this tomb, and the lights were turned on, I could understand perhaps why it had been off limits for so long. Because as the lights came up, we were surrounded by images that were so brilliant and vibrant in color, it looked as if the artist had just left the day before. Impeccable. With many tourists and the humidity of their breath in a closed area. The quality of these images would deteriorate very rapidly. Well, it was on this particular tomb, on these walls, that I witnessed for the first time in my time of journeying into this part of the world, an image that had been referenced in many of the mystery schools to the Egyptian god Osiris, who's the god of resurrection, the god of eternal life, the God who transcended the polarity of time and space in this world in another cycle before our time. And at the end of this domed chamber, along the walls were all the experiences that Osiris had moving up to the time of his great transition. All of the experiences of life and the experiences of family and of gathering food and all the things that were happening. And at the very end, he portrayed for the first time that I've ever seen his secret in terms of how he transcended the polarities. For the first time, what we saw was the image of Osiris flanked at his shoulders by the sign of the Eye of Horus, through the Eye of Horus mystery schools, which we see commonly as the left eye. Rarely do we see the right eye. And he was flanked by both, the left and the right eye of Horus, representing the left eye and the right eye of Horus mystery schools. Horus, who was the son of Isis and Osiris, he was the product of their union. The left and the right eye representing the two mystery schools based in two very different, although closely related philosophies. The left eye based in the logic and in the left brain knowing of our world, and that's the path our Western world has taken today. So we essentially have lived this left brain of Horus mystery schools through our societies and our technology. The right eye of Horus represents the feminine aspect, the intuitive, the feeling, the emotional aspect of our world. And in our technological society, up until recently, we've done our very best to circumvent that, to do anything we can do to stay away from the feeling and the emotional component. Well, here in this tomb, 200 steps underground, what we're seeing is Osiris is sharing his secret. He's saying in the only symbolism of his time, the secret to achieving and transcending this polarity, achieving this lasting experience, is the union of left and right brain, the union of logic and emotion. And once again, we see what we're reminded of so often through these mystery schools, that as great as our logic is, as important as our left and right brains are, they're incomplete. If we view the world through left and right brain, we'll always view the world in the separateness of left and right, light and dark, good and bad, right and wrong. That our logic must be tempered with the wisdom that comes from our hearts, the wisdom of the experience, the wisdom of feeling and emotion. And it's through that we are able to transcend the great challenges of life. I've referenced several times these three parameters of prayer: thought, feeling, and emotion. What is the difference between feeling and emotion? In recent years in the West, we have merged the two into a single concept, feeling and emotion. The ancients, however, identified them as closely related yet separate. And what they said to us is this, that feeling is the union of a thought and an emotion. So if we're having a feeling, it's the union of thought and emotion. Emotion can be considered the power source that drives us forward through life. It doesn't have any direction until we apply thought. Thought may be considered as the guidance system. So thought by itself is impotent without the power to drive it. Emotion, power by itself, is impotent without the guidance to direct it. It's the union of the two that allow us our reality, the reality that we call our world. Another way of looking at this is thought may be considered imagination. Emotion may be considered desire. And when we find a way to merge our imagination and our desire into a single, directive, potent force, then we create our reality. So thought and emotion produce feeling. Feeling is the digitally measurable vibratory template that allows us to create in our world, and that feeling is the key component to the lost mode of prayer.